2:30 in the morning, December 25th, 1944. Snow lies thick and blue-white across the fields west of Bastogne, and in a shallow foxhole outside the village of Hemroulle, a glider infantryman of the American 327th Regiment presses his cheek against frozen earth and listens. Somewhere out in the dark, beyond the tree line, there is a sound he has heard before and never wants to hear again. The low, grinding clank of tank tracks on hard ground. It carries for miles in cold, still air. He cannot see the machines yet. He does not need to. 18 German tanks are moving towards him under cover of darkness, engines throttled low, infantry jogging alongside in white snow-smocks to muffle their silhouettes against the drifts. Behind them, further back at Rolle and Champs, other American positions are stirring awake to the same sound. This is the moment Adolf Hitler has demanded, the moment his generals have promised him, the day Bastogne falls. It does not happen. By the time the sun rises fully over the Ardennes that Christmas morning, every one of those 18 tanks will be a smoking wreck in the snow, and the crossroads town they were sent to take will remain, against every reasonable expectation, in American hands. What unfolds in the 6 or 7 hours between the first clank of track and the last burning hulk is one of the more remarkable defensive actions of the Second World War in the West, fought not by a division holding prepared lines with air superiority overhead, but by exhausted, half-frozen, badly supplied paratroopers and glidermen who had already been surrounded for a week and who had, 3 days earlier, told their besiegers in a single unprintable word exactly what they thought of surrendering. This is the story of that morning at Hemroulle, and of why a scattering of American foxholes on a Belgian hillside mattered rather more than anyone on either side had expected. To understand why the Germans were attacking a small village most people had never heard of on Christmas morning in a snowstorm, it helps to understand how badly Hitler's entire Ardennes gamble had already begun to unravel by the time this assault was ordered. And to understand why it failed as completely as it did, it helps to understand exactly what the 101st Airborne Division had built out of almost nothing in the week since they had raced the Germans to Bastogne and won by a matter of hours. That is where this story really begins. By the third week of December 1944, the German offensive through the Ardennes forest, what the Allies would come to call the Battle of the Bulge, was already running badly behind schedule. Hitler's plan had called for his 5th and 6th Panzer armies to smash through a weakly held stretch of the American line, cross the River Meuse within days, and drive on to recapture the port of Antwerp, splitting the British and American armies in two. The whole scheme depended on speed and on seizing the road network that ran through the Ardennes highlands, and every one of those roads, all 7 of them, converged on one small crossroads town, Bastogne. Whoever held Bastogne held the ability to move tanks, fuel, and supplies through that country. Whoever did not would be forced onto narrow farm tracks, in winter, at exactly the moment speed mattered most. The Germans had not expected to have to fight hard for it. Intelligence suggested the area was thinly held, and for several days that assessment looked correct. American units, worn down from earlier fighting in the Hurtgen forest, delayed the German advance as best they could, buying just enough time for the 101st Airborne Division and part of the 10th Armored Division to reach Bastogne first, arriving on December 18th and 19th, mere hours ahead of the leading German armor. By December 20th, the town was completely surrounded. Some 18,000 American troops, along with a considerable number of Belgian civilians who had nowhere else to go, found themselves cut off inside a shrinking perimeter roughly 6 miles across with dwindling ammunition, no winter clothing to speak of, desperately short medical supplies, and a wounded list that was growing faster than anyone could evacuate it, because there was nowhere to evacuate them to. On December 22nd, German officers under a flag of truce delivered a written demand for surrender to the American command post, warning of annihilation by artillery if the garrison did not comply within 2 hours. The acting American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, is said to have read it, laughed, and scrawled a single word in reply that has since become one of the most quoted lines of the entire war. The demand was refused. That evening, weather cleared just enough for transport aircraft to begin dropping supplies into the perimeter, a lifeline of ammunition and medicine that kept the defense viable but did not come close to solving the underlying problem. Bastogne was still surrounded, still outnumbered, and the German High Command was under direct orders from Hitler himself that the town be taken, whatever the cost, no later than Christmas Day. That order fell to Major General Heinz Kokott, commanding the German 26th Volksgrenadier Division, reinforced for the occasion with a fresh regiment of Panzer Grenadiers and a battalion of Panzer Mark IV tanks from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, newly arrived and, crucially, not yet exhausted the way most of the German units in the Ardennes by now were. Kokott's plan was straightforward on paper and devastating if it worked. He would strike the western edge of the American perimeter at two small farming villages called Champs and Hemroulle, which between them controlled the roads running into Bastogne from the west and were held by roughly a battalion's worth of American glider infantry and paratroopers, spread thin across open snow-covered fields with almost no cover. Break through there, and German armor would have a clear run straight down into the town itself. The attacking force that assembled in the darkness before dawn on December 25th was built around 18 Panzer Mark IV tanks, each weighing around 25 tons, roughly the mass of a loaded articulated lorry, mounting a 75mm gun capable of punching through the armor of most American vehicles at typical Ardennes engagement ranges. Riding on and alongside the tanks were 4 battalions of infantry from Colonel Wolfgang Mauke's 115th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, backed by 2 battalions of armored field artillery and a company of self-propelled guns. It was, for this stage of the bulge, a genuinely formidable package, assembled specifically because earlier, smaller German probes against the perimeter had been thrown back, and Kokott needed something that could not simply be absorbed by a few foxholes and a couple of bazooka teams. Against it stood men who had, by any normal military reckoning, no business holding their ground at all. The 1st Battalion of the 401st Glider Infantry Regiment, along with elements of the 327th, had been in their positions for days in temperatures well below freezing, with little in the way of winter uniforms because the airborne divisions had jumped into France and Holland earlier in the year, expecting short campaigns, and had never been properly re-equipped for a winter fight in open country. Ammunition was rationed. Artillery shells were counted individually before being fired. What the Americans did have, though, was ground they had had time to study, a scattering of anti-tank guns and tank destroyers from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion dug in at angles chosen for exactly this kind of assault, and a defensive doctrine, hammered into every airborne unit since Normandy, that said a surrounded position does not automatically mean a defeated one. At around 5:30 in the morning, under cover of darkness deliberately chosen to deny Allied fighter-bombers any chance of intervening before the attack had gone in, Mauke's tanks began moving southeast from their assembly point between the villages of Flamierge and Givry. They advanced in the classic manner of an armored breakthrough attack, tanks leading with infantry sheltering close behind them, machine guns firing on the move to keep American heads down. The leading elements struck the positions of 2 companies of the 327th 1st Battalion and simply drove straight over them in the dark. It is worth pausing on what that actually meant for the men on the ground. A Sherman, or Panzer IV, rolling over a foxhole in soft snow does not necessarily kill the man inside it, if the hole is deep enough and narrow enough, but it is an experience that has been described by survivors in terms that need very little embellishment. Total darkness, the deafening scream of an engine directly overhead, the ground itself seeming to buckle, and then, if you are fortunate, silence, and the tank rolling onwards towards someone else. That is exactly what several of the overrun Americans did. Rather than break and run, they stayed put in their collapsed positions until the tanks had passed over and the following waves of German infantry came into view, then rose out of the snow and opened fire from behind the advancing panzers, catching the Panzer Grenadiers from a direction they had not expected trouble from. It bought critical minutes. Meanwhile, roughly 2 miles to the north at the village of Champs, a second German column ran into a fight every bit as fierce, house to house in weak dawn light, against paratroopers of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment who had reinforced the position days earlier and had no intention of giving it up. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The critical moment came just west of Hemroulle itself, where Malka's spearhead split into 2 columns, a maneuver that made sound tactical sense on a map and turned out to be close to catastrophic in practice. The larger group, roughly 11 tanks, wheeled east and continued its drive directly towards Bastogne. The smaller group, 7 tanks, turned north towards the village of Rolle, where, unbeknownst to the Germans, the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment had its own headquarters in a 16th-century chateau, all but undefended because virtually every man on the staff was already forward on the perimeter fighting. For a short, extraordinary window that morning, 7 German tanks came within perhaps half a mile of overrunning an American regimental command post with almost nothing standing between them and it. What stopped them was a scratch defense thrown together in minutes from clerks, drivers, and staff officers, supported by a single American tank destroyer company designated A Company, which maneuvered into position and, over the course of perhaps 20 minutes, destroyed every one of the 7 tanks in that column. The larger column, meanwhile, the 11 tanks pushing towards Hemroulle and Bastogne itself, ran directly into the guns of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, reinforced by American tanks, glider infantrymen, and gunners of the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion who had, days earlier, moved several of their howitzers into direct fire positions astride the road specifically to cover this kind of armored approach. What followed was less a battle than a slaughter conducted at close range in poor light. 10 of the 11 tanks were destroyed in the fields around Hemroulle, caught in overlapping fields of fire from guns their crews often never saw before being hit. A single tank, separated from the rest and apparently believing it had already broken through into Bastogne itself, drove on alone and was captured intact, its crew astonished to discover they had been taken prisoner rather than triumphantly entering the town. By the time full daylight had broken over the Ardennes that Christmas morning, every single one of Malk's 18 tanks had been destroyed or captured. 92 German soldiers were taken prisoner. Communications back to German divisional headquarters had broken down entirely after an American artillery round struck Malk's own command post, so that for hours afterwards the German general commanding the operation, Cocotte, continued to believe his tanks were on the edge of victory in Bastogne, entirely unaware his armored spearhead had ceased to exist. It is one of the more striking details of the entire engagement. The attacking commander did not know his attack had failed until long after it had. Comparing this action with what German armor achieved elsewhere in the Ardennes offensive throws its failure into sharper relief. Just a day earlier, on 23 and 24 December, the reconnaissance elements of the German 2nd Panzer Division had come tantalizingly close to the river Meuse itself, further west, before running out of fuel and being cut off and destroyed piecemeal by American armor, and near Dinant by British tanks of 30 corps that knocked out several Panther tanks on patrol. That collapse, like the one at Hemroulle, illustrates the same underlying German weakness by this stage of the war. Individually excellent tanks and crews, thrown into action without the fuel, the numbers, or the coordinated support to exploit any local success they achieved. The Panzer IVs at Hemroulle were, gun for gun and armor for armor, broadly comparable to the American Sherman tanks they faced, and considerably better armed than the towed anti-tank guns of the tank destroyer battalions defending the village. What decided the outcome was not equipment. It was the fact that the Americans had had time to choose their ground, register their guns, and wait, while the Germans were attacking, at night, into a defense whose exact strength and disposition they did not know, with no real prospect of reinforcement if things went wrong. The wider Allied response over the following 48 hours only compounded the German failure. On December 26th, Elements of the American 4th Armored Division, spearheading Patton's Third Army drive north, punched through the German ring southwest of Bastogne and made physical contact with the defenders, ending the siege after 8 days. Heavy fighting continued in the sector for another week as the Germans, under continued direct pressure from Hitler to retake the town, threw fresh formations into the fight, including battered elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, without success. The Christmas morning attack at Hemroulle and Champs had been, in real terms, the Germans' best and last serious chance to break the perimeter from the west before Patton's relief column arrived. When it failed, the strategic window failed with it. The material cost to the American defenders across the whole Bastogne fight was heavy. The 101st Airborne Division alone recorded 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing in the roughly 3 weeks of fighting around the town. But the psychological effect of the Christmas Day repulse was, if anything, more significant than the numbers suggest, both for the men who had held the line and for the wider Allied war effort. Word of the battered bastards of Bastogne, as several of the division's units proudly nicknamed themselves, spread quickly through Allied ranks and back home, becoming one of the defining American narratives of the entire Ardennes campaign, a surrounded, undersupplied, poorly clothed force that had been told to surrender and had refused, then destroyed an armored attack sent specifically to force the issue. For its defense of the town, the headquarters of the 101st Airborne Division was later awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, along with the Belgian Croix de Guerre, with Palm. Today, the fields around Hemroulle are quiet farmland again, much as they were before that Christmas morning, though a marked historical route through the area still leads visitors past the village and its small memorial to the paratroopers of the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion and to the residents of Hemroulle itself, whose presence and support for the defenders that winter is still remembered locally. Surviving vehicles and equipment from the battle can be seen in museums in Bastogne, and the outline of the old American positions can still be traced with a little patience across the gentle rise of ground west of the village. It is worth returning, in closing, to that first clank of tank track in the darkness, heard by half-frozen glider infantryman lying in a snow-filled foxhole at 2:30 in the morning. He had no way of knowing, in that moment, whether the machines coming towards him would roll straight through his position and on into Bastogne, ending the siege in German favor on the very day Hitler had demanded it end. Neither, in truth, did the German general who sent them. What decided the outcome was not some decisive weapon or masterstroke of tactics. It was a defense built, in the days before, out of careful positioning, dug-in guns, and men who had already been told to surrender once and had already said no. 18 tanks went out into the dark that Christmas morning. None of them came back. A town that should, by every reasonable calculation, have fallen that day did not fall at all. That, in the end, is the whole of the story. Not a battle won by brilliance, but a battle lost, tank by tank. In the snow outside a village most of the men fighting for it had never heard of before that winter, and have never been able to forget since.